admitting. Welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's collective conversation that's going to be facilitated by our course mentor, Mama Dee. I'm very excited for today's session as Mama Dee's work focuses on uplifting the voices and the value of community-based knowledge. Mama Dee's work with community-centred knowledge is attuned to Indigenous minds, the work of progressive feminine perspectives, and takes a whole earth-centred approach. The work is based on a core philosophy of African thought, Ubuntu, that there is an interdependence across all aspects of life, and that we engage with work both with and as a community member, and as such, knowledge is informed by community experience. Personally, I've been really inspired by the work of community-centred knowledge in relation to food justice and food sovereignty. So I would recommend going and having a look at the community-centred knowledge website, which moves people from a more critical to a more critical understanding of the importance of food in our lives as we navigate a global and UK food system, and especially with relevance to prevalent social issues and inequalities that exist within that system. Mama Dee's work acknowledges a colonial legacy in relation to food and the juxtaposition of extracting foods across the globe to cater for wealthy appetites whilst creating hungers and patterns of deprivation at the other end of the spectrum. Mama Dee is a community researcher, an organiser and a facilitator whose background is based in transformative justice, and work is grounded in an embodied approach which adopts action research methodologies to bring together and explore varied voices. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Mama Dee.
Thank you so much, Grace. Thank you, collective, for helping us to arrive to this moment. I've really enjoyed all the community conversations so far, and I hope that you will also enjoy this one. I'm hoping that what this 2 hours will be doing will be in pursuit of a pro-healing agenda for our lives that is principled and resilient enough to take on the very complex load of toxic relations that the human system has deformed itself with, and which it seeks to almost as an autoimmune response, project into its future dystopian non-relations with life. So I'm saying to you, here is a journey to embark upon. You're not alone. You have never been a limited self. So my question to you, to your hearts, is, can you rise to who and what you truly are? Hopefully there's going to be a little bit of humor here. There's going to be a bit of talk. There's going to be reference to different identities. None of my references are pejorative, but they will be drawn from the literature in the way the literature refers to different identities. I'm not really giving a trigger warning as such, because I'm not, hopefully none of these ways will be at all, to use that word, activating. So I have an informal methodology that I take recourse in sometimes when I reflect upon what I'm maybe currently reading, or when more than one idea arises in conjunction to what I have encountered, either through reading or discussion. Maybe I've watched a video or listened to some audio, or maybe it's just some thoughts that arise in my frequent conversation with the more than human worlds. Yes, I do talk to my plants and I listen to them. Anyway, it's this, and it's what helps revive my sanity or keep my sanity going. I imagine a flying saucer on the outer peripheries of the stratosphere, in which there are two alien beings who have been in observation of the Earth for a considerable period of time. They are both named Omni. There's Omni 1 and there's Omni 2. Omni 1 has accompanied Omni 2 because they value companionship. When certain encounters with the material that I'm coming across, or reflections that I have, are run past Omni 1 or Omni 2, they react with their whole bodies. Their response to my reporting to them about human interactions with the Earth mostly have them in one long belly laugh, rolling around in the aisles of the spaceship. And why? It's because humans, they have surmised, are extraordinarily stupid and short-sighted. So yeah, if I come across something and I think, I can't believe this has happened, I can't believe that this decision has been made, I can't believe whatever, then I just think of Omni 1 and Omni 2 rolling around in the spaceship, just laughing their heads off, recognizing our gross stupidity. It helps. Let's start with foundations. Everything has its foundations. Foundations may reach back into the mists of time and may feel lost forever. But foundations can also be understood as complex behavior patterns which are embedded in our genes and environmental relationships and transmitted from generation to generation. They dispose us to repeat the same patterns unless we're able to arrest this programmed behavior and really take a fresh look at ourselves to diagnose the nature of this drifting foundation. We can look at what has taken place as a result of this drift, and how we might take stock, consider the damage, and try to make repairs of what is broken. You know, if the pattern is deformed, it's not beautiful anymore, then maybe we need to fix it, we need to repair it. And we can also identify ways in which we might remodel the whole pattern or re-establish healthier foundations for future behavior. What I'm going to do over this period of time is to look at time and space in a variety of different ways. I understand space as the materiality of time, and yeah, that's my configuration. Let's try and work with it. So I'm going to be putting to you various things to consider and to interact with, and let's see where we arrive at the end. We ought to try to swim around the ideas of time and space whilst we're considering antiquities and futures. If we don't do that, a failure to do so means the majority of our conclusions will be very provisional, which of course, for the most part, they should be, right? They should be understood as provisional because they're conclusions which definitely need revisiting the next time we have a moment to reflect. The main senses of time and space that we work with, I believe, are colonial, colonized time and colonized space, and the colonized time and space nexus. I mean, it couldn't really be otherwise. The idea that we must have supreme, that is derived from imperial, authority over these two human constructed objects or structures almost goes without saying. I mean, it's an obvious truism. We made it, so it's ours. We must own it. The majority of written down material in the world has come out of what we here in the West refer to as either the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. Together, these things, together with their resultant behavior, are what I will be referring to as whiteness. So if I use the term whiteness, I'm just talking about the accumulated knowledge, industry, ideas, behaviors, actions, and everything of the Renaissance and Enlightenment and what they have produced up till the current date. The Renaissance is literally, as the name says, the rebirthing of a culture both within itself and in other places in order to farm, I'm using the word farm, generations of humans in levels of objectivity so as to institute a series of civil lies. Of course, that's why there is a civilizing agenda consequent to landing, that is to say, creating land where there once was kindred earth, in locations far from where one had migrated to in the forgotten past. I'm saying that last thing because even people who consider themselves absolutely sedentary and absolutely belonging to the Western Europe have actually come here from somewhere in the dim and distant past and have usually conveniently forgotten that and consider themselves as settled. So I'm going to share my screen now because I have some definitions that I've come across of these concepts. I hope you can see this. Yep, good. So this is a definition of the Renaissance. I'll read it because it's a lot of text there. Apologies for the volume of text. The Renaissance was an important event in European history that stretched from the 14th century to the 17th century. It was preceded by the Middle Ages in Europe and eventually led to the major events of the Age of Entitlement. Oh, sorry, even that's correct, right? But it doesn't say that. Enlightenment. In historical terms, the Renaissance is important because it led to a major shift in European thought and worldview. While the Renaissance is considered to have begun in the city-states of the Italian peninsula in the 14th century, the main ideas of the movement eventually spread to all of Europe by the 16th century. The most significant changes that emerged as a result of the Renaissance can be seen in European architecture, art, literature, mathematics, music, philosophy, politics, religion, and science. Historians have identified several causes for the emergence of the Renaissance following the Middle Ages, such as increased interaction between different cultures, the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts, the emergence of humanism, different artistic and technological innovations, and the impacts of conflict and death. So I want you to digest bits of that. It's from a website, which the link is there. I want you to notice the important reference to different spaces or geographies in this definition. In colonial narratives, time and space always refer to each other so as to keep their immoral marriage intact. Also note this definition, which I'm going to show you now, of the Middle Ages, which can also be referred to as the Dark Ages, because what is dark is unknown, like dark matter or dark energy, and it is also often the birthplace of being. We wonder, though, who is applying the notion of darkness here? Because if, as a dark-bodied person, I take on this particular idea of darkness, then I announce to the colonizing world that I too am unknown, that I don't know myself. And that's untrue and self-deprecating as it is unhelpfully misleading. So I'll read it. It says, the Middle Ages in Europe is considered to have occurred between the 5th and 15th centuries. It was a major event in the history of Europe and world, and is related to several other important events, including the Black Death, the Crusades, and the Renaissance. So let's also consider the Entitlement, which is put there, the Age of Entitlement. I keep saying entitlement, it's this Freudian slip. The Age of Enlightenment was an important time in the history of the world and modern Western societies. It occurred during the 18th century and is known as a time period of great change and new ideas. Specifically, the Enlightenment involved an intellectual movement in which famous thinkers and philosophers challenged some of the basic foundations of society. It would have a large impact on later world events, such as the French Revolution. I want you to consider these questions. Who was it important to, and who was it important for? Because clearly, I mean, there's a reference here that it is an age in Europe, but it also refers to the entirety of the world. So I just want you to reflect on that. Who was it important to, and who was it important for? And then I would like you to think about, what are the values being held here in the words modern, intellectual, and famous? Also note that contemporaneous with the French Revolution was that other French Revolution in Haiti, where arguably the statement and ideas of liberté, égalité, fraternité from Robespierre in 1790 were being held with more serious consequences than on French soil. However, Dessalines, warrior father of the nation of Haiti, disputed these Enlightenment values and statement. We can also notice that the term Enlightenment was not necessarily bringing illumination for all, for the light that it shone cast quite scary shadows in many places. We're aware that during this period, lots of terrible things were happening. Yet, there is a saying that we cannot hold a torch to light another's path without brightening our own. Was this what the Enlightenment was? And Martin Luther King Jr. also observed, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do this. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. We appear to still be bathed in much ignorance despite all of this enlightenment. Within the UK, in Scotland in particular, Scotland lays claim to many Enlightenment scholars. Maybe you can think of some. There's Joseph Black, there's Robert Burns, William Cullen, Adam Ferguson, David Hume, Francis Hutcheson, James Hutton, John Playfair, Thomas Reid, and of course, there's Adam Smith. But it is also one of the nations of the UK to be dragging its heels significantly in acknowledging what it brought in terms of violence and deprivation to the dark bodies of Africans and others during the Ma'afa or the Mangamizi. Before then and afterwards, I understand that it wasn't until 1998 that the Museum of Scotland thought it was possible to mention the word slavery throughout at all, anywhere in the entire museum. This is according to one of Scotland's sons, a scholar called David Alston. So what then is this Enlightenment? When we speak of time, it also means that we become embroiled in this other idea, colonial time and space configurations. I want to share with you some ideas about colonial time. Right. So what it says there, was Enlightenment ideas about progress and evolution underpinned notions of human perfectibility, the ability to improve oneself, by characterizing the growth of civilization as something which represents an advancement through time. And that's in a book called Colonial Time by Giovanni Nani, written in 2012. And to show you another way of looking at colonial time is this diagram here, where we're moving from the left-hand side of the screen to the right. So from where it says the past to the future. Now, because of the conflation of colonial time and space, it understands that what is backward, is also removed. Well, it's backward in time, it's behind in time, are the places that are far from the centers of civilization. The centers of civilization are white. The peripheral and distant areas are dark, because of course they're far from the Enlightenment, so they must be dark, okay? And the movement of colonial time is from that primitive and dark space in the past and in the global South, which lives in the past, through various transitional phases towards becoming more like the future and more like the global North. there's an increasing sense of being more modern as one approaches the future and the global north. It also corresponds with increasing status and increasing whiteness in terms of skin color and social, cultural, and economic behavior. Of course, that also corresponds with how more colonized one becomes. So an extremely colonized mind is the one that's in the global north and in the space where the future is. This is the way to think about colonial time. Of course, development follows that arrow. What we want to do is to bring everybody, drag them kicking and screaming from the past into a place of the future. But from the global south, not literally, we want them to stay in the global south. We don't want them over here, but we want to bring their, in terms of their ideas and how they operate and live and their behavior and their trading and all of these different social, cultural, and economic behaviors, we want them to resemble us here, this space of enlightenment in the global north. However, these notions were echoes of what white Christendom positioned as the ideal in its original evangelizing mission during its establishment in the medieval period, early to late medieval period. So this is not a modern thing. So even though modern development processes echo this, this was established in, you know, as early as the 5th century. And the constant warring, violence, and bloodshed of this epoch was effectively in order to settle this order upon as many bodies as possible, whilst at the same time as claiming the earth space occupied by those who were clearly spiritually inferior according to the emerging doctrines of Byzantine emperors, popes, and scribes. What we might also notice is it took time and labor of missionaries, of course, to spread the word and to violently convince those that they had landed amongst that the only real time was represented by the fact that 7 days constituted a Roman week. They had Roman deities that typified them, except that Britain fought back and insisted that Freya would inhabit Friday instead of Venus. You know, French is vendredi after Venus, and I think that's replicated in other Romance languages. And that unless people recognized and honored a Sabbath, that they weren't truly human. There was one particular Scottish reverend who declared in his writing, whilst in Jamaica, this was later on in the 18th century, that even though, because of Enlightenment, that there were disputes concerning whether or not Christ actually existed and the nature of his being, that the enslaved Africans need not be made aware of this, you know, although they were going to be preached to and made to go to church and what have you, that in order to have the sufficient veneration, obedience, and respect in accordance with the white mission-born scriptures, these were far too important and objective to risk diluting. So we wouldn't tell them the truth, we'll tell them a story. And then there are other situations where, for example, the Yanomami people indicated that for them, the past, which is something that they knew well, must be in front of them. And that the future, which was to come, must be behind them because they couldn't see it. They wouldn't know what it is like. So it must be behind, away from the eyes. But this would have disrupted what the Christianizing mission was bringing. So concepts of space also needed to be deformed. This is where space and time come together and become co-disrupted. Literally, these concepts had to be made ugly and rejectable in favor of the civil lies of obedience and complacence. So the alternative was the imposition of the violent Inquisition, which had been exported from Spain by that time to the Americas. What took place was a colonial reordering of things during both the Renaissance, involving not just time, but also space. And, you know, this is what I'm arguing has taken place. So I think we need to date the changes and the centralizing and the civilizing mission to much earlier in how we understand colonialism having taken place, and the bed or the foundation being laid for racism. Now, I want us to think about the fact that we're used to living with objects all around us. And we call these things objects. Here is a bottle, you know, here are the glasses and so on. Our only subjective relations we tend to have are with ourselves and maybe still a few others, although I think most of us will notice that this is shrinking. I want you to just for a moment take a little bit of time to reflect about the use of pronouns. So I'm not just talking about personal pronouns, but all of the different kinds of pronouns. And apparently I looked this up before putting this down, and apparently there's at least 8 different types of pronouns in English. So there are possessive pronouns, as in this is mine, yours, ours, etc. Personal pronouns of, you know, the ones that we're used to, relative pronouns, reflexive pronouns, indefinite pronouns, demonstrative pronouns, interrogative pronouns, and intensive pronouns. And I'm not going to give you a grammar lesson, but some of these pronouns might include he, it, you, I, they, we, who, him, them, whoever, anyone, something, nobody, anybody, and so on. Pronouns are words that tend to replace nouns in speech. I want you to think about which possessive pronouns do you most often use. So just think about that for a moment. Which are the possessive pronouns that you tend to use? And then I'd like you to think about, what does that say about you and your relation to things? Would you ever think about using personal pronouns, familial, you know, personal pronouns with those things of the earth that have both become more widely referred to as objects and possessions? Think about why this is. Think beyond what you were taught. And actually, whilst we're thinking about grammar, I'd like you to think about these articles, a, the, and an. When do you use a? When do you use the? Or when do you use an? Can objects have personalities separate to that which we use to refer to them? And how well do we know things or objects that we can ascribe particular and absolute qualities to them, as in the bottle? We know all about the bottle, so we're calling it the bottle. It's not just a bottle, about which there's a indefiniteness to the idea of the bottle, but it's the bottle. That's a relationship of authority, of knowing. Think of what this means for our relationship with things and beings. It might not so much matter with the bottle, but what does it mean for your relationship with a llama, an elephant, the tree down the road? So I have a question that I'm going to ask you to take into breakout rooms. And the question is here: if we had to refer to many common objects around us as if they had autonomous lives, past, presents, and futures, what impact would that have on our practice of responsibility? How would it make us less or more responsible humans? If we were able to refer to the various common objects around us as if they had lives, as if they were he's and she's and they's, as opposed to the's or as, yeah, as if they could talk back as if they had autonomy, how would it transform our levels of responsibility towards things of the earth? If we had to talk about Sister Mountain or Brother Grass, and we had to mean it, how would it affect our relationships of responsibility? So Maya, if you could convene breakout rooms with no more than 3 people in a room for 10 minutes, so that's about 3 minutes, to talk about what you think about this question, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
Thank you, Mama D. Wow. Yeah, like making like furious notes.
I'd love you to answer the question.
Yeah. Ours, I think it made me think about the people that their car is their mine, our, like a human. So that's one way that it does happen. But yeah, the responsibility to the earth is much more present, greater, and urgent. It made me think about what would I be able to throw away and not feel like super guilt around that. Yeah, make me glad I'm a vegan, but then still eat the vegetables. Thank you, flower. Thank you, earth. Thank you, grass. Sometimes they can be a bit like that. I think the yogi stuff is quite embodies that. What about you, Grace?
I'm still trying to unpack it. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that I feel like it's like I'm having to rewire my brain to think about the words and the concepts in the way in which you put them, Mamadi. So it feels to me like I feel as though you speak in poetry. And I hope you don't mind me saying that. But for me, then I have to like unpack and unravel the sentence, which I can find quite hard to do on the fly. But what I would say is that when you were talking about the idea of the as like a definitive and an authority and stuff, and when you said earlier that we refer to the land and it has this like possessive pronoun over it, whereas you referred to the sacred earth, and I know that the is the same pronoun, it's the same like not pronoun, it's the same like article in front of it, but it has a different meaning. Like it takes on a different meaning for me.
Yeah, and I think what you've said about poetry is so true, and it almost I think I thought that straight away when I heard you speak like 2 years ago. It was like, well, but poetry is more past, present, and future all at the same time. It isn't linear, so it makes so much sense to me anyway, with all of this. Although I know nothing about pronouns, I didn't even know there were all those pronouns. I was
So I just
Googling the word pronoun as you said it. I was like, what's a pronoun? I know I use that word. What is a pronoun? It's so interesting that the way, or what word you use matters so much.
And you use the we pronoun, Mamadi, correct?
I like to try to. I don't. Like there you are. I don't always.
Yeah.
But we us ours. I've seen it. Pronouns. We us ours. So good.
Yeah.
So good.
It just feels right. It just feels more responsible.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things it does is to slow us down.
Mm.
You can't just like, okay, I want to pour some more coconut water in my cup, but this coconut water has its own kind of feeling about where it's come from. It's come from somewhere, right? Probably under deep stress. I'm actually taking some real stressed coconut water and putting in my cup. The whole plantation it's come from, the innocent has got it in it from. Yeah. And so it makes me want to think a bit more before I buy another coconut water for starters. Then
It
it's
pays
in
due
this,
respect.
yeah, it feels like, oh, I'm gonna finish it because it's here. Like I'm not gonna, but I just like think, yeah, this doesn't feel quite right, and I want to take more time because I could have bought, you know, the coconuts in their own containers and things like that. I think it just slows one down, and I think I would buy a lot less.
And even relationally, I think with other humans, it makes quite a difference how you relate if you talk about our rather than my, because quite often I did make a deliberate thing to use our, not my, around work that I do with other people. And it was quite difficult at the beginning because I was so used to like being possessive around my and what I do and my achievements, and actually after a time it became quite relaxing. But I feel there is quite a prevalence in the world to push my forward, me, I did this, but then it also does sort of wind up that being perfect and being brilliant and it being all down to me to get it, to make it happen and make it right, when actually it is a collective. Everything is a collective, whether you like it or not. It relies on each other. So but yeah, with the earth, I'll have to do that more, but it's going to be hard because then I'm not going to be able to eat or do anything. I'll be like, the guilt.
But then, you know, I think, but don't you think there will be a transition, you know, a transition zone where we have to fight with how we've been doing things all along, and then eventually it becomes more normal. Yeah, it's our work we're doing right now. Yeah, and so that means I've got to think about the sharing. Yeah, I've got to think about better communication. Yeah, I've got to listen more. All of these different things that it requires. Yeah.
So sometimes I find that I use we when it's maybe not, it hasn't. So my partner tells me, he's like, you say how, so apparently I say things like, oh, we should think about, or maybe we should, or something. And he's like, but you're putting that to me as though that's an option for me to do that. But what you're actually saying is, this is what's going to happen. And he was like, and just because you've said we doesn't mean that like collectively we're in agreement about that. So I think sometimes I can use we in a not very like collective way, but when I want it to be my way, I don't know. That's horrible, isn't it?
I might argue that the should in that sentence might speak
eradicate
the we.
Yeah.
We should rather than we could, or what I'm thinking is, you know, because if it is what you're thinking, then it isn't we.
No.
But we could think about it based on what you could think about. I don't know. Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I think in teaching that happens quite a lot. There's a we that's used that doesn't mean we. It's a kind of more like a, it's very third persony, like we could blah blah blah, but it doesn't embody the sense of we, does it? So yeah.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, that could, should, would does defeat it. I
now I'm feeling a lot of shame in relation to that, but that's okay.
No, it's just our human perfectibility. Is that what they say?
Yes.
But you know, it's like I was noticing that because when I probably have definitely used it in the text because, you know, speed, but I think that I was writing shoulds and saying I can't put should there. We can, we might, you know, and it changing the sentence and then thinking, okay, I'm just going to go with it, you know, like, yeah.
It's that precision of language that I think that actually, in a way, this transformation is actually taking us away from our language and like making us be too, because everything's done at speed, right? It's all about production and getting, like, producing more. So when you like shorten words or you give things like don't give them enough credit. I don't feel like in terms of whiteness and the Enlightenment, what I think happens is that we try and in English language, we try and shorten things down. But as a result of that, you lose meaning. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Are we not?
And it's really interesting what you were saying about like the philosophers and stuff like that, because I'd never really questioned like philosophical thinking, and because I did philosophy at A level, and like where that had all come from and why it was that way. Sorry, that's a separate point, but I was like, oh.
Yeah, I liked civil lies as well.
Yes, civil lies.
All of them. It's so right. So right. I like enlightenment for enlightenment as well. Enlightenment, entitlement, enlightenment.
I'd not thought of that one.
You'll be Freudian doing that.
Whiteness.
Okay, well, let's get back.
Yeah. Leave breakout room.
I'm not certain about how many people are back.
Most people are back now.
Okay, all right. So, yeah, I know that everybody's muted, but if anybody wants to share either in the chat what kinds of conversations they had in terms of, the conclusions, in terms of how behaving in this manner would affect your own sense of and practice of responsibility, or just open. I can't see people, so I'll rely on the team to get you to speak.
So just unmute yourself if you want to speak.
You can raise your hands, but do contribute to the chat. It'd be interesting to see.
Something I was thinking about and our group was talking about was the idea of care, and how often if we own something, or at least in my experience, if I own something, I treat it with less care than if it was someone else's. So yeah, that idea of power and owning, and then also how dismissive the word "it" can be, how we can use the word "it" to put something below us. So you can say refer to an animal instead of by a gender, but as it, to be dismissive of something. I can't remember the other things we were saying, but that was what was really in my head. It was the idea of care and hierarchy, I suppose, as well, where we put ourselves above things that we would refer to as the or a or it. Yeah, that's what I was.
Thank you. Any other sharing?
Yeah, if I can do it. Yeah, one thing I kind of got to with the person in my group was the idea of like, what would an experience be like without the concept of object? And if we did use pronouns to talk about what we now call objects, would we need that concept? And what would it be like to be in a world that that concept didn't exist? And how would that affect, what you did?
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, what would replace how we are now? Any other thoughts? Okay, I'm gonna just move. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Apologies, somebody. I was just going to say, how would that relate to other languages that do pronoun some objects, in terms of like, would German and stuff have like a pronoun attached to an object? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think we all do have some kind of pronoun attached to an object. Some give a gender. So, I mean, in French, you know, it's la table, isn't it? You know, so I don't know how it's experienced, you know, not having been in France for a long enough time, if it's understood in that way. I think, generally speaking, many, at least European languages, still objectify things, you know, even if they've got a gendered pronoun. But yeah, moving on to this idea of relating to things differently, I would argue that the reason why we call people indigenous is that they are people who exercise responsibility for kindred earth beings, you know, for the so-called more than human. And indigeneity as a quality varies across the earth in relation to the extent that coloniality was able to disrupt relationships that people had with the earth and with earth beings. So if you remember that table, I don't know if I can go back. Nope. Yeah, this table, this chart or whatever here, I would argue that back on the left-hand side, that in the, you know, the global south and in the past, in the zone of the primal and the primitive, that our relationships with things was holding more respect. We were more, or we are more in this situation, more relational. And that what coloniality does by moving it over to the right is disrupt that relationship. So enslavement was arguably one of the biggest disruptions, because it totally ripped the people from the earth and placed them in another space, and didn't really give them time. It wasn't like a holiday, like we're ripping you from here and we're putting you here and you've got time to talk to the trees and stuff. It's like, you know, we're whipping you because we want, you know, we're whipping and breeding you, and all these kind of terrible disruptions. Indentureship also disrupted, but more temporarily, and enclosures also disrupted in situ, and well, largely in situ. Sometimes people had to move as a result of enclosures. And, you know, according to other kinds of orderings of people, according to their ability to generate other people's wealth. So you had the development of social class. And then the landscape itself was reordered in terms of how productive it was. So certain areas, you know, soils were able to be more productive. So they were intensively, and I would argue aggressively used. So in this wise, we must be aware of the Middle Ages relationships between the landed gentry, the barons and the lords, and their fermiers. Now, fermier is, I think it's from the Latin, is the word that was used for a tax collector. And the tax collector tended to be the right-hand man of the baron. And his position in relation to the baron meant that he was a trusted employee. And as such, he got all the baron's favors. As a fermier, a tax collector, he was able to have that relationship between the other tenants. But if the baron decided to go, you know, on a crusade and manage to get more wealth, then some of that would be passed to the fermier. The fermier might have had, how can I say, rewards of a little bit more land, and then and money, and he would be able to afford to employ some of the other serfs to work his land. So the fermier slowly became the farmer. That is the root of the word farmer, the fermier. I can't really go really into this, but all of this is an account of the history of farming. Yeah, and its export subsequently, as this is, obviously these barons, who were traveling, thought this is a good way of getting more productivity out of the land because it's an object, and exported it as a colonial tool. I can't do enough justice to it now, but needless to say that the different kinds of disturbances between the human and kindred earth in relation to the ability to relate to her produced all kinds of difficulties in our ability to appreciate disturbed earth with sensitivity. So when people are forced off from and away from their relationship to, with the earth, there's a lot of pathos. We feel for them. We must also feel for that earth, because the earth as a being is experiencing that trauma too. So are the trees, so is the things that grow there. And there's a book, Indigenous Agricultural Revolution, which talks about how enslavement from West Africa created all kinds of ecological disturbances in situ. All these ecological disturbances are evidences of earth-based trauma, if you like. So all of this understanding would perhaps help us to be more balanced in our consumption patterns in relation to practices of balance and reciprocity, and to understand the dynamic of what actually is creation or creativity. There was a time when we intimately understood that as belonging to the earth, we are created by her dynamic in balance with other living things. It was complex, emergent, and orderly. It had its own order. Having been able to extract surplus from everything around us, including ourselves, because we are also becoming objects, we have largely lost that sense of balance. We do not know really what life is, being so afraid of death, its neighbor and complement. Time has become very manipulated and also distorted. We now believe that creativity means extraction, more distortion and waste is inevitable. But importantly, we produce rather than create, based upon the logic of what has been produced from the modality of extraction, exhaustion cycles. So we think, if we can produce things, we're being creative. It doesn't matter how, we don't have to be in balance with anything. We don't really have to think about ways somebody else takes care of it. We've become so broken up and compartmentalized and unable to relate to life in all of its modalities. We have lost the plot. And in so doing, we are losing our minds. The gadgets that we create are already our masters. Progress is about compliance with the logic of the gadgets, not compliance with the logic of life. I'd like us to just break for about 7 minutes. I'm asking if the spotlight can be taken off me and we can share as a gallery. Then let's just do a little bit of breathing. I've shared a lot of stuff. Can we take me off me being on the spotlight, or the spotlight, and can we have a gallery view, or is that up to me?
I think the spotlight's
up to me, right? Okay. If people don't mind putting on their videos, it'd be nice to see you. And let's connect with our relatives in our vicinity, huh? No worries if your camera doesn't work, no worries. I believe you're there. No worries about that. Let's connect with the things around us. We're seated, let's connect our bodies to where we're seated. What does it feel like? Is it hot now? Is it cool? Is it scratchy? What's it feel like? Where are your hands? How are the clothes that you're wearing talking to you? What are they saying? Are they weeping because they've been produced from oil extraction cycles? Or even if they're natural fibers, what's the process that's gone into their making? Have you given thanks for what you're wearing, even if it is oil-based? It came from somewhere. Where's it going to go to? The air around you has been recycled umpteen and umpteen of times. Who else has the air passed through? If you've got plants in your room, then you're breathing their gift of oxygen. They're enabling you. When did you last say thanks? If you'd like to stretch in any direction you'd like to stretch, your arms, your legs, if you have space. And as you're stretching, just feel that you're reaching out to all the beings that you've forgotten to say thank you to show appreciation, to listen to understand the feelings of. We are in connection. I'm going to leave you for the remaining, I don't know how many minutes, 4 or 5, to have a comfort break, do what you like, have a drink, and then we will resume.
What time would you like us back, Mama D?
So, yeah, actually in about 1909.
Cool, thank you. I'll add that to the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome to those just arriving. We're just having a quick break and we're coming back about nowish.
Okay. If people are back, then I'll resume. I'd like us to think about our human histories. Share. Slide. Yeah, as we've been learning about race, we might want to think about its foundations. Most people locate their foundations here, would locate their foundations in the foundations of race, sorry, in modern Europe, maybe in the 18th century. People like Linnaeus may come up, or Buffon, or Blumenthal. There's such a whole host of people stretching from the 17th century to the present day. But why should we give preeminence and energy to a string of who are essentially all white men? But maybe we must, because the measure of a human has been linked to whether or not one meets the standard of being in the past, present, or future that corresponds to the ideas of who and what is human, that has been set largely by now dead white men, who perhaps we ought to think about in terms of their own humanity. Other people who have written about race include, well, there is Sylvia Wynter, who talks about the over-representation of man as the human. But I'd like us to kind of explore race in different ways and come back to it again. So thinking about differences that we have, differences from what, one might ask. But anyway, let's consider who we are. And I'd like you in the chat to name some of your differences, the things that you think make you different or unique. So if you could just share that in the chat for a bit. Sharing actually, so I can have a look at the chat. What makes you different? What makes you unique? What makes you you? Can be a short sentence, word or two. I hope we haven't been talking about words so much, it's just made you not want to write anything in the chat, but go for it. Think about your uniqueness. I know I can see you all being really careful here. Not sure you're unique. Some interesting things coming up there. If you were to be specific about the ways in which you're writing the things that make you unique, combination of people I have met in my life that have been teachers and educators to me. Okay. What is unique about me? My natal chart, what I love and hate, my values. I'd love to know what those values are, what you do love and hate, and what your natal chart says, and things like this. My values, what are they? What are your relationships? We might ask ourselves when looking at these things that have been named, what are they different to or from? Yeah, how we demarcate ourselves. So what are they different to or from? And I want us to James, if you ever come across anybody with that name, more than oneself from birth to now. Yes, of course. A rejection of a central ideal, queerness. So yeah, lots of interesting there. I want you to think, in holding all those things that you said there in the chat, to think about markedness. And I don't know how many people have come across this idea of being a marked person. Difference alone is set up in relation to some kind of norm, right? So let's call that norm a thing which is not unusual in a group of people, a community or society. It's a generality. These things which are normal are called unmarked. So unmarked equals normal. Normal might be that people can swim, for example. So if you don't swim, you are set apart as a non-swimmer. As a non-swimmer, you become a marked person. You're marked as a non-swimmer. As a marked person, it is easier then to apply special rules to you. Maybe non-swimmers don't get to go on holiday camp or jog by the lake or have the same breaks as normal people. Sometimes the rules for marked people may be that statisticians start to identify other characteristics about them. In this case, for those who cannot swim, maybe they find that such people have a particular range of weight or height profile or skin texture or length of eyelash. You know, could be anything. People with these kinds of markings then get really indelibly marked and identified as abnormal. They're not normal. They can be of such an extremity that they might be referred to as strange or alien. Those with some of these markings who turn out to be, say, Olympic swimmers, become identified as a credit to their kind of abnormality, yeah, as exceptional and able to have access to things that unmarked or normal people have. And I've written here, whoopee. Okay, that's just a picture of things. Let's think about human movement, and I'm going to share my screen again. Come on, change. Why it's not moving. Okay, it's moved. So let's look at this slide on labels for people who move. What do you notice about the red and the black letters? You know, people who move get called a lot of different names. What have you noticed about these names, and how or why have they arisen? So although I can't see you, I'm hoping that Zoe or Grace, you'll be able to support people to just speak out. What have you noticed about these names, labels?
So do feel free to say if anyone's noticed anything.
Well, I think the ones on the bottom, the red ones, are ones that are used to refer to white people. nicely.
And I think that the ones in red are said what's the majority, and the ones in black are marked.
I want you to think about what might happen if those labels were completely reversed whenever you went on holiday to a place that maybe migrants come from, or asylum seekers come from, or aliens even come from. Because apparently you can take a boat to a place where aliens come from, right? Would it provoke a national outcry that you went on holiday and you were received by local people as a refugee? You'd come there to seek refuge. Is a holiday a form of refuge seeking? Do people come from other places because they want to discover things, or they come as tourists, or they want to explore, they want to travel, write about Liverpool? It's interesting how these things stick. When I first met some of you, I think maybe some, maybe not all, I introduced this idea about a man and a dog and an observer. I want to revisit it in the next slide and give you this scenario. You leave your house each day to go about your daily activities as normal, but every day you encounter the following scene. Across the road is a yard in which you can clearly see a man who is repeatedly beating a dog. The dog is crying out, barking, yelping. The dog is clearly in anguish. This happens daily. You witness this scene of a man beating a dog every time you leave your house. The question we pose to you is this: who is being traumatized? I'll leave it there for a little so you can read it again yourself. Who is being traumatized? Here's a visual depiction of what I've just said. There's the man beating the dog, and there is an observer. I want us to think about the fact that one of these people is the perpetrator, one is an observer, and one is a dog. That each of these can be at the center. Well, actually, before I proceed, let me stop sharing the screen, because I want to ask you to say in the chat, just put in the chat who you think is traumatized. If you can just quickly write in the chat who you think is traumatized. Thank you for those responses. If you haven't written, please do write. I would agree that all three are traumatized. And in fact, in the context of what we've been speaking about so far today, we have to perhaps think about the ground underneath their feet as also experiencing the trauma of this repeated action. And is there something about going to a place where there's been abuse happening that affects one? So that's something to think about, which I hadn't included here, but it's something that has arisen in my thoughts just now. The dog, as victimized, may in turn bully other dogs, which have observers, human or otherwise. The observer may be traumatized and then turn into a bully, recognizing victims as opportunities. The perpetrator is already within a triad, but may be an observer of other triads in which he is not active, because perpetrators may easily perhaps form gangs of elite or proletariat nature. Can you think about collections of bullies in everyday Western culture? It's important to understand the perpetrator as possibly being us. We don't want to identify with perpetrators. Perpetrators are those other people over there. We put them in prisons and we lock them up, and they're not us. But if we continue to think about perpetrators in that way, yeah, we perpetuate the problem. We have to understand that that everybody is potentially a perpetrator of violence, of cruelty, of inhumanity. Yeah, and that the otherized perpetrators need to be understood as that, because that's the only way they could possibly be rehabilitated, by appealing to their humanity. Yeah. And it's quite important, I think, to think about these triads in that way, and the way that they reproduce themselves in different parts of the world over time and space. But if a perpetrator has access to institutional power, yeah, there are all kinds of other consequences. Yeah. There's a framing of Western civilization as a power, having access to institutional power that it itself has created, which is enabling it to perpetuate and perpetrate continuous violence. And it's interesting because you've written different kinds of the police, the government, landlords, some bosses, the 1%. We have to think about us, the situations we're in, a group of footballers, a gaggle of teachers. I don't know what the collective pronouns are for us. We have to include ourselves there, because when we keep otherizing, we keep perpetuating, because then there's never the possibility of taking responsibility for what we are complicit with. Yeah, so we have to understand that we're living in a civilization that has perpetrated a great deal of violence on its own people. And it's learned from that to be able to do it elsewhere. And we are here, the legacy of that. So you may have people in your own lineages, yeah, who are that. And in having those people in your lineages, that means they're in your DNA. They are you. You are part of them. There is I wish I could have quoted it, but that would have made this session 4 hours. But there's a whole big argument about people saying, oh, we cannot apologize for colonization, slavery, whatever. We can't do that because it wasn't us that did it. It was those people in the past. We are not them. Yeah. But when it comes to pride over the past, oh yes, our ancestors did this. We can't have our cakes and eat it. We either shun the past entirely and forget it doesn't exist, it ever existed, and we operate from where we are now. And is that even possible? We might want to understand religion as an antidote to fear that has no other outlet but to structure its defenses in ways that assure itself of forms of safety in the present, past, and future. I've gone on to a whole other thing, ideas about what are the defenses? Religion may be one. We have to understand that, well, let's share my screen again so I can just share you an idea of what stress looks like. So let's have a look at that. Again, I can't really go into this. I hope you can kind of appreciate it. In the middle is, you know, us under stress. And a certain amount of stress is tolerable. We're built to be able to dance with stress and not be overwhelmed. So we have sympathetic nervous system responses of fight, flight, or freeze, depending on the extent of the stress that we're receiving. Feigning also is another one. And if this stress response is repeated and continuous, it starts to become also a hormonal response. It's not just the nervous system, it's also a chemical endocrine system in our body. It pays in the societies that we live in, some of this stress is we're activated by things that we encounter on a regular basis, right? So it used to be maybe the saber-toothed tiger or whatever, you know, the threat of flooding, the, you know, these kinds of things. But it's now mundane, it's media and advertising, it's education and schooling, it's organized religion, all of which cultivates fear. Yeah. Are we good enough? Will we make it? How is that person going to fear? Can I send my child to school without fear? To combat that, we have a parasympathetic nervous system, which requires us, in order to be able to just do very normal things like digest our food, to reproduce, and to connect with others, it requires us to be calm enough so that the sympathetic nervous system is not activating us and the blood supply is not being just diverted to our limbs, you know, and away from our brains and away from our soft organs. So all we want to do is fight and run. We need the blood supply to go to those organs that enable us to digest properly. If we're really stressed, we get indigestion, and we want to be able to think properly. So we need good blood supply to our brains. The caring, the connection, these are just like kind of tropes to help people remember feeding and breathing. The ability to do that relies on us to be calm. If we're not, we're going to eventually become sick and overwhelmed. It's going to be all too much. Family, community, different kinds of connections enable there to be an oppositional and opposing sense of values to the things of fear cultivation. Some of it is related to an oxytocin effect. So yeah, this is a really rough, sketchy idea of the stresses that we go through. In our civilized nation, what happens is that we get repeatedly stressed and we don't get time to go onto the left-hand side sufficiently. Yeah. And again, I can't move this. Right. And what happens is that instead of having a healthy culture where we're able to have relaxed action, rest, negotiation, a balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic, a return to a ground state, balanced with engagement and rest, there's increasing stress or shock, yeah, and it goes to that flight, fight and freeze reaction, engaging with the emergency engagement of the dorsal parasympathetic, it returns to this place. But when there's overwhelm, the whole system is just unable to go back to the left-hand side. And so we become sick in different ways. Yeah, we're not able to think, we're just overstressed, we can't think, we don't have time, we're constantly engaged in social media and on our phones. And I've noticed recently a plethora of articles just talking about how we don't have any attention anymore because we're constantly drawn to so many things. We can't focus. Our ability to focus, part of our being humanness, is being eroded before our very eyes, literally. Yeah, this is all contributing because what we're watching, what we're viewing, what we're reading is things that keep on activating us. So we're hardly able to settle. And even if we settle a bit, we're not going right down to ground state. We need to think about paths of return, how to seek rest, how to seek contact and more than superficial relationship, how to seek to give and receive care, to nourish and be nourished, and to be in balance with our entire environment. Yeah, we need a return path. Sorry. Right, so I want to think about another thing. So I'm just giving you little bits of jigsaws about human determinism, how when we encounter each other here in the West, we tend to ask each other these kinds of questions. Where do you come from? When or where were you born? You know, questions about your family, your month of birth, your politics, your religion, your health statistics, about what you read, about what you eat. And all of these kinds of questions, all in the quest of finding out things to determine who you are. I once remarked that one of the things that happens in very many cultures is one of the first, in the first encounter, people ask you how you are. And they don't ask in one simple question. It will be a very long statement. And if you ask people how they are, they will really tell you. And there will be a very long introduction, yeah, between yourselves. And that introduction is so vital to our sense of establishing safety with each other and the ability to connect. So in actual fact, this culture has become, those cultures have become cultures that enable and support a deactivation, a settling, a possibility of connection. Our cultures used to be like that, but we've moved away from that. Maybe there's something about recovery. Maybe the fear of going back to the left-hand side of that chart shouldn't be as present. What, after all, is progress? Who is determining it? So all of these questions, I mean, what do they mean without any further understanding of context? Do we ask these questions to reassure ourselves in relation to norms or markedness? Is there some underlying need to conform or to get people to conform? And in which case, what are we conforming to? A state of ill health, dis-ease, not well-being? There are some other kinds of things that we use to determine each other. There is astrology, for example, or tarot systems and numerology and all of these kinds of things. But just to talk about astrology, it's quite an old belief system. They are also architectures of knowledge which allow a structuring to contain fear and to order relations in a predictable way. It is one of the ways which counters the purely secular way or rational ways of determining who the other is or who the self is. Yet it itself was colonized, and beyond the intimate projections of stars in ancient cultures, such as ancient Babylon and Egypt, has been produced an Earth-centric as opposed to a solar-centric Western astrology, which has been further reduced to newspaper and magazine horoscopes using algorithms. We seem to be sick with the reverse of the Midas touch, as if everything we touch turns to something that contributes to our state of unwellness. It is not as if we do not have a relationship with all of the other non-human elements that may be determined by our their internal and external properties, as well as our own in interaction. But to be able to predict, describe, have authority over all of this may well have been the founding structure of religious authority. When we speak of histories, we are describing worlds that have been shaped by modernity. So these are not absolute worlds, but relational spaces that relate to each other, which have interacted in ways that are responsive to the effects of the developing systems of being, which have been offensive: colonialism, right? In all of the way that any world will have experienced it. So this is the process of coloniality. It's coming in with the authority and power, an activating impulse, an unsettling impulse and control, and it infused with violence, because violence is asserting one's will over another. There's an attack and claim first and deal with the consequences later. But we're still dealing with the consequences because we're also held in thrall by a constant repetition of the founding myth. One of the myths, a major myth that is referred to within Europe, is called the Black Legend. You might want to look this up and find out more about it. But within Europe, it concerns the roots of how Europe has been shaped by the systems of Renaissance ideology and power, largely themselves being centered on how religious preeminence was mapped onto Enlightenment secularism. Yeah, so a movement from Catholic to Protestant to science and its methods. You know, Enlightenment might be described as a flame which burnt many of those who could not adhere to its heat. So those of us who remain have somehow become used to being burnt, used to the fire. This legend, and you might liken the word legend as, you know, when you use a legend in a map, like a key system, as opposed to a grand myth, or maybe you can think of both, enables us to understand why there are differences across Europe in terms of power, status, and politics, and why they arose. It speaks of the ways, for example, that Southern Europe played such a significant role in medieval and Renaissance colonization that it became identified by the people that it first colonized, and which colonized it. In Spain, for example, were found the Moors and the Jews, who had possessed much of the land before the kind of North European Aryan pushback, you know, right down to 1492, when Philip and Isabella of Spain were able to ask Columbus to bide his time while Andalusia was taken and he could set off to the Caribbean. So we have images like this, and I came across this just yesterday, depicting the invasion of Western Europe by non-white Muslim army after the 7th century AD. It very nearly extinguished modern white Europe. Certainly the threat was no less serious than the Hunnish invasion, which had earlier created so much chaos. While the Huns were Asiatics, the Moors were mixed race invasion, part Arabic, part African, and part mixed race, always distinguishable from the Visigoth whites of Spain. So 1492 there is shown as, you know, the just prior to the recapture of that last stronghold in Andalusia. There are all kinds of stories. There's amazing stories about Columbus being possibly himself half Jewish and then an illegitimate child of Philip. So that his being asked by the royal family to wait until they'd captured Andalusia before he could set off he was intending to go to the Indies, but they wanted him to actually carry some of the Sephardic Jews to relative safety away from the Spanish Inquisition. He ended up where he did, and the rest is history. Walter Mignolo talks about, he speaks about talking about using a term, landnomia, in the way we speak of astronomia or astronomy. Because from the 16th century onwards, human went around naming and claiming the Earth as land in the same way that planetary satellites were also named and claimed during the study of astronomy. I thought that was an interesting idea, the as above, so below. So, you know, we named things in the heavens and there was an impulse to do the same on Earth. So there is the Treaty of Tordesillas, I should have included a map, which was dividing between Portugal and Spain, the world. Imagine the arrogance. I mean, I don't think you could, I mean, just imagine if you have a partnership at home and you decide, well, we're dividing the garden or the balcony or whatever it is, and I'll have this bit and I have domain over it and you have domain over the other. I mean, it's a bit ridiculous, but this is what could happen. This is what has my aliens in their spaceship rolling over in the aisles. How limited in scope have we been as humans? The world religions, which we understand as derivative, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, had a geographic distribution which became associated with the more imperialist of Christian conquest. Events like the Crusades and the activities of the warring centered in the Byzantine era, corresponding to much of the Middle or Dark Ages and its establishment of itself by creating hierarchies of others in relation to itself. For example, there was the idea that Jews who had crucified Christ were old Israel, and the white Christian or Gentile adoptees of Christianity were the new Israel, who had now inherited the rightful legacy to the full suite of ethics and codified behavior that Christianity at that time evoked. You might, for example, recall there's hymns like Jerusalem, and there are various popular mythologies which circulate on the idea that indeed, you know, England in particular, or parts of Western Europe were the new Jerusalem. So there's the Jerusalem, and there's books and films like the Da Vinci Code, Ironclad, and these kinds of material. Many of the religious conferences, such as the large one of Nicaea, were set up to establish orders of the Christian church, which also had the effect of otherizing the Judaism and the followers of Islam as those who belonged to categories which were increasingly cast as infidels, unclean, and left behind by progressive white Gentile Christianity. And we see this reflected in some of our classic books. So C.S. Lewis is all about that, if you remember the Narnia stories. And there are other stories which also effectively are replicating this narrative of the Middle Ages. So when we play games that are centered in medieval Europe, it's almost as if the only kind of Middle Ages was European Middle Ages. It's like, what was happening in the rest of the world? You know, like the majority of the world at the time, you know, it's like the idea that the flood of Noah was everywhere and not just in a particular locality, you know, within that story. Let me go to the next slide. From this paper, this this allocation depended on the theological notion that Christianity, conceived of as the spiritual Israel, superseded Israel in the flesh, that is, Judaism. So in the late Middle Ages, this spiritual Israel not only came to be aligned to nation, excluding those not belonging to this new Israel, who were the Jews, but also to a Christian Europe. In this constellation, Islam was perceived as either a return to the old law, Judaism, or a regression to pre-Christian paganism. Like Judaism, Islam was associated with backwardness, literalism, blindness, and the flesh, while Christianity was tied to spirituality, wholeness, and the rightful orientation to body, gender, sexuality, and scripture. These imaginaries were intimately tied to notions of the body, rendering Jewish and Muslim bodies unstable, fragmented, and polluting. Importantly, not only was the Jewish and Muslim physical presence understood in terms of pollution, but religious practices such as circumcision were as well. And so there was a whole lot of languaging of the time around, you know, those who were holy because they weren't circumcised, as opposed to, you know, infidels who were. And there's a lot of literature actually on it. Some scholars date the emergence of race or proto-race to precisely this moment when Christianness was fully tied to bloodline and ancestry, and permanent or unbridgeable separations appeared between the new and old Christians, established by binaries which could not be bridged. There was a term around the 15th century in the Romance languages, raza, which stood for race, but it was applied to the breeding of horses. But then you have somebody called, I don't know if I'm mispronouncing his name, Jacobus Salodatus, for example, told the readers of his child-rearing manual in 1538, "What is done with horses and dogs should also be done with men, so that of good parents there might be born a progeny useful to both the king and the fatherland." Secularism, which came with the Enlightenment legalities, used maritime legalities to achieve what religious legalism sought after in the various conferences and pronouncements by the popes across the domain of Christendom. The church extended itself through different kinds of savagery that claimed and maimed hearts and minds. Yeah. Now, if we understand this violence which spread Christianity, whether it's the Crusades, whether it's you know, Scottish Presbyterians being sent to the Caribbean, whatever, if we were to write all these stories up and add it as extra books to holy books such as the Bible, how would we receive them? Because in actual fact, some of these books do have stories of violence, and somehow we've incorporated these things into our normality, and it's become an everyday colonialism that one accepts because, you know, it's important to spread the word of God as in how the Bible is positioned. It's interesting. The Spanish and Portuguese early relationships with difference resulted in the Inquisition, of course. And so the idea that the Inquisition led to the removal of Jews and Muslims from Spain for the sake of a purity of bloodline. So this is why scholars locate racism even in these early periods. The control of the civil society is the control of subjectivity by re-inscribing actively a racial matrix of power that, since the 16th century, was an imperial instrument. Control of authority, control of the economy, control of labor, and control of the population. of all those who have been integrated into the Christian civilizing missions of the market economy, and those who became the rest, who cannot be integrated and that could rebel. A global political society has always been in the making, sometimes through anti-imperial reactions, other times through clear decolonial projects, from the indigenous rebellions in the 16th century to the Black Maroons fleeing from plantations to Indian nationalists and different manifestations of uprisings in Africa. That's a quote from Walter Mignolo. But I'm saying that there is a critical importance of decoding how precedents were set in earlier times and how they pattern themselves ever since. Somehow we need to break that patterning. Earlier on, I talked about foundations and new patterns, but these new patterns we need to be able to create, to demarcate a new set of relations, a new set of convictions, which reclaim our imaginations and our ability to look towards healing and repair, rather than help perpetuate the stories that don't serve us. So just as the man beating the dog also hurts himself in the act of committing violations of spirit of the victim, so perpetuating the story of the aggressor, we reinscribe, we make deeper impressions in our minds and bodies that these ways are somehow inevitable. In so doing, we perpetuate the colonial story of the way of aggression, of non-integration with life, and the need for violence to achieve our ends, regardless of the fact that most mechanisms of violence today are harming beyond the human. Also, of that which arms the earth, that which harms the earth, namely ecocide, also harms its perpetrators as they become imprinted by this violence. So it works in both ways. Ecocide hurts us in the end, but our attempting to hurt others also hurts the earth. So we perpetuate an immoral cycle. To what degree does this take place at the everyday level? Let's take a moment to reflect on that question. How is this happening in your lives? How is it happening in the everyday? In terms of trauma theory, we reinscribe the original harm in our bodies, in our behavior, and towards each other. For every victim, in the initial inscribing of whiteness as something with meaning in the earth, as responsible for the setting up of violations and injury, harm, and repeating violent deprivations, is also a collateral damage in the systems which make up the oppressor's own hinterland, his own body of beings, which are ultimately also himself. So it's the same thing that I'm saying. By perpetuating hurt, it's coming back and hurting you. We now make ourselves, even beyond the idea of designer babies. In many ways, we have already become extensions of the gadgets which we believe we employ, but which employ us in the service of them. Think about that. I want to say that again. We think we now make ourselves, right? Even beyond the idea of designer babies. In many ways, we have already become extensions of the gadgets which we believe we are employing for our own uses, but actually the gadgets are employing us in service of them. We have created a hierarchy based upon the ultimate visible aspect of the human, the color of the skin. We obsess about it. We have reduced those amongst us with the greatest level of pigmentation, with the greatest level of abjection. A counterforce, because we love binaries and dualities. We understand that those with the darkest skin are a base plate upon which sense making is conducted. It's like the construction of that chart I showed you. Without to have the right hand side, you must have the left hand side to talk about movement. So the existence of Black abjection, right, enables a kind of a sense making of everything in between. Proximity, therefore, to whiteness is our goal. And as whiteness merely means the deep patterning of coloniality towards dystopian algorithmia, this means we are moving towards becoming the objects of machines. And why? Because we fail to listen to Mother Earth, to the life which preceded us, to our elders, trees, mountains, rocks. And like errant children, we exist in the burning ashes of the post-Enlightenment fires of doom. Let us embrace new metaphors of recovery, which are mindful of the long histories of whole-scale deprivations. Let us not employ our minds, but integrate all of our bodies into a generative pluriverse, where the wisdom of all of the elders can be brought into play in conversation with the insights of the youth, of all of the places and of all of the times, because the complexity of our ancient systems, such as Ubuntu, the Tao, Sumak Kose, and Ma'at, have still little been explored. And we have nothing to lose, but everything we have ever known to be good. I'll share the last slide. If we don't know where we're going, any road will take us there. To Sankofa, which is the image of the bird reaching for the egg on the back, on its back, it is good to go back to where you have left behind that which is good for you in the future. Sankofa is co-generational. It's about ancestry as energy that spans lifetimes. It's about respecting the elderhood in everything. It's about learning over one's whole lifetime and never stopping. Thank you so much. I don't know if I've overshot a lot. But,
thanks so much. Thanks so much, Mama D. That's, I just want to say a huge appreciation from all of us, really. I felt like everything that was being said, such a sensitivity and depth, and it's so multi-layered. I wouldn't really know how to start to kind of sum up all of what you've just brought to us, but there's just such a lot of heart and generosity and care in that knowledge. And I think the way it's delivered is so much part of it as well. So I thought maybe I'd just remind everyone of the aim of the session, which you said was about pursuit of our collective pro-healing that is principled and resilient, and that we are not alone or a limited self. And maybe just to end with that question that you pose to our hearts, which is, can we, can you, can we rise to who and what we really are? That's my summing up.
thank you.
Did anyone else want to say anything? Or should we finish there? I know we've got to 8 o'clock.
Just huge thanks. And yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think I'll be digesting and it will be enriching me for a while to come. So yeah, big thanks.
I miss the days we can all be in a room together and just clap and cheer and stand up for you. So yeah, just inviting people to come off mic and give Mama D a big clap.
I prefer hugs, you know, but hey.
Or hugs. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for
Yay.
the course as well. 2 hours is a long stint.
Much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will prepare actually a list of the references that I've used so that you can have an opportunity to explore them yourself, and other bits and pieces that I've engaged with. might even give you a translation of what this plant here is thinking. Let me have a conversation afterwards.
Well, wishing everyone a really beautiful rest of your evening, and yeah, thanks for making time. And we'll be in touch again over email with future events and the next session. I think, do you remember the date in February? Is it the 9th of February with Penny Wangari Jones doing her talk?
Yeah, the 9th of February for Penny's session, and one of the delivery teams is next week on the 26th.
What did you say at the end, Grace? One of
the delivery teams is next week on the 26th.
Could I do a little plug for the Monster exhibition at Left Bank, which is there until the 29th, which is all about this traumatized nation state that we're in that inflicts further trauma. It's very, very powerful. And so Left Bank Leeds website, you have to book on because it's an animatronic exhibition, but so much of what you've been talking about tonight, Mama dear, was just making me think of a lot of the images in it.
I went down on Saturday night, Maya, and just to see if I could get in on an off chance I hadn't booked, and I managed to get in. So
yeah,
if people are just passing.
We encourage people to book, so there's limited numbers, so people can really get into it, you know. So,
yeah, I second that. It was
There's also the exhibition of I Am Witch that's in Lancaster at the, I can't remember the name of the place. Yeah. Story Gallery.
Yeah.
Don't know how close you are to Lancaster. I'm coming up actually to it. The exhibition goes on till the 29th. There's a special event, I Am Witch. The shows have sold out. And on the 25th of this month, the Race and Climate Justice Group is having a session on a climate justice glossary. And yeah, I'm thinking about these things as well, how we can work with them as well.
What was that, Mamadi, was it climate justice thing?
The race, I don't know, Maya, have you got the link for it? If you can put it in the, on the 25th from 6 to 7:30, it's a race and climate justice. It's talking, that's really terrible, I can't remember the title. Talking care into climate justice or something like that. So yeah, you can, I think you can still book on Eventbrite, and there's a link there that Maya has shared.
I haven't found the Eventbrite, but that's just the Instagram post which has the details on it. I'm looking for the Eventbrite, sorry.
Yeah, take care and have really good evenings and good reflections.
The Eventbrite's in the chat now, if anyone's still here. Oh, thanks, Grace. I didn't see you put it there too. Nice to meet you, Sid. Do you want a quick debrief in a breakout room, or?
Yeah, it'd be good, I think.
Should I